when he read the description in the Qur'an, he thought about it. He said it's when it describes the human being that at one stage it resembles alaka, a leech-like clot. He said, I'd never thought of that before, but he went to the zoology department and asked for a picture of a leech, and it looks like the embryo. So he put both pictures in one of his textbooks. He has another one on clinical embryology. When he presented this information last fall in Toronto, it caused quite a lot of stir across Canada. It was reported in the newspapers. It was on the front page of many newspapers across Canada with some funny headlines, but people don't clearly understand what it's all about, I guess. One headline said, was it surprising things found in ancient prayer book, something like this. But one newspaper reporter asked the professor, they said, don't you think maybe the Arabs might have known about these things? The description of the embryo, its appearance, and how it changes and grows. Maybe because they weren't scientists, but maybe they did some crude dissections. They carved up people and examined these things. So the professor had to point out to them that the man had missed a very important point in all the discussion. All the slides that he projected for us, all the pictures he showed us of the embryo were taken through a microscope. He said it doesn't matter if somebody used to try to discover embryology 14 centuries ago, they couldn't see it. Because all of this appearance of the embryo described in the Qur'an is when the item is still too small to see with your eye. You need a microscope to see it. Now the microscope has only been around for a little more than 200 years. So he also suggested, he said, if you believe that maybe 14 centuries ago somebody had a microscope, and he did this research, and they made no mistakes, and then they somehow talked this man into putting it in his book, saying, this is true, trust me, put it in your book. Then they destroyed their equipment, kept it a secret that they ever had a microscope. He says, if you believe that, be my guest. He said, but you really shouldn't say that unless you bring some proof, because it's so ridiculous. In fact, when he was asked, how do you explain this information in the Qur'an? How did it get there? His explanation was, it can only be revealed. Now that's a non-Muslim, but a man who knows. That's all he has to say. One of his colleagues, his name is Marshall Johnson at the University of Toronto, is in a related field to embryology. But he became so interested in how what the Qur'an said guided the Professor Moore to some interesting ideas that he asked the Muslims to collect for him everything they could on another subject. He wanted to see if it would lead them to anything. As a hobby. His hobby is geology. So he asked, would you collect everything the Qur'an says about geology, that is the structure of the earth? He wanted to see where it might take him. Because some people have been very surprised in that regard. In fact, there's a man from Yemen, Sheikh Zindani is his name, who has a very effective way of delivering Islam to people. He doesn't tell them that's what he's trying to do, but he collects things like this. He went to a British man, who was a professor of geophysics, that is the construction of the earth. The man was also an atheist, as it happens, and had written some on atheism. But he asked him, he said, if the earth opened up and swallowed me, what would I see? And this professor said, that's a good question. And he gave him quite an explanation. He said, inside the earth you would find such and such and so. And when he had finished his description, the sheikh passed to him translation of the Qur'an, said, would you read that verse? Because there's an ayah where it talks about some of those who opposed Musa. It says, if the earth was opened and swallowed them, they would see such and such and so. And here was the description the man had just given. He was so surprised that he accepted Islam on the spot. This, in fact, is on a tape recording of a talk that Sheikh Zindani made. He had the tape recorder running in the man's office to bear witness. Here's the man, here's what he said. In any case, don't be misled in what I'm getting at here. I'm not trying to prove to you that the Qur'an is a revelation by telling you these things. What I'm talking about here is an attitude that's in the Qur'an that you won't find anywhere else. Because the Qur'an does a very interesting thing. When it gives information like this, it often tells the reader, you didn't know this before. Now, there is no scripture that anybody has that I know of that says things like that. There are ancient writings and scriptures that many people have, and they give a lot of information, but they tell you where the information came from. You have the ancient history of the Bible, for example. And when it tells you this king lived here and this one fought in this battle and he had so many sons, then it tells you if you want more information, read the book of so-and-so, because that's where this came from. It tells you where the information came from. But the Qur'an says, in many cases, here is information which you didn't have before, but check on it. You'll see that it's true. It's interesting that that was never challenged by the non-Muslims 14 centuries ago. The Meccans hated the Muslims. And time and again they would hear this kind of thing. They'd hear some piece of information, and then part of the revelation says, you didn't know this before now. Now the Meccans never spoke up and said, that's not true. I know where he got that. We learned it in school when we were children. It really was new. And the Muslims followed the advice given here. It said, if you doubt it, check. Check if you don't doubt it. So it was that when Omar was the Caliph, he chose a group of men and said, go find the wall of Dhul Qarnayn. The Arabs had never heard of it before, but the Qur'an tells you what it looks like and where you find it. So Omar said, you, go find it and report back. It should be in such and such a place. When you get there, it should look like this, and so on. So they went off to find it. It's in what is now called Derbent in the Soviet Union. Now again, my point here is that the Qur'an may be accurate about a lot of things, but accuracy does not mean that a book is a revelation. What it means is you have a problem. It means you should find some explanation for where did this information come from. But an accurate book is not necessarily a divine book. The telephone book is probably accurate. It doesn't mean it's a revelation. But the point is to work the other direction. If you find a mistake, then you disqualify something. And that's what the Qur'an encourages. There was a man came to me after a lecture in South Africa last year, and he was very angry about some of the things I had to say. He said, I'm going home tonight and I'm going to find a mistake in the Qur'an. I said, congratulations, that's the most intelligent thing you've said. That's what you want to tell somebody to do, because the book offers the same challenge. It says, do you think this is not what it says it is? Then try this, try this. It's supposed to make you look. It's not a book that is delivered as though you are commanded to believe it. Now read it. It's supposed to work the other way. You read it and you come to believe it because you can't disqualify it. It earns your respect because you cannot find a disqualification. Now again, I have to stress, just because you can't explain something doesn't mean that you can take the first explanation somebody offers. You see, you may have some religious groups who will tell you, look, we had a miracle last night. A man came to us, he couldn't walk, and we said some words and he got up and he walked. How do you explain that? And if you say, I can't, they say, you see, I have the true religion. It's the power of God. Maybe, maybe not. Just because you can't explain it doesn't mean you have to accept his explanation. The same goes for the Qur'an. If you find something remarkable and surprising in there, just because you can't explain it doesn't mean that you have to believe it's a revelation. That's your business. But it shows the difficulty that people have if they say, I don't believe it. The Qur'an points out that these people have an obligation to find an explanation then. In fact, it mentions one man in an ayah, which I have always seen mistranslated into English at least. It talks about a man who heard the truth explained to him, and then it says why he was guilty.